You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. On today's programme, a new normal, the stark images showing how the US is heating up as areas of California experience historic droughts. We find out how British banks' support for the coal industry has increased despite global commitments to move away from fossil fuels. And saving our seas and the carbon stored in them. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world right now and meet those coming up with the solutions. We aim to take you to the heart of the climate crisis, explain the data driving the changes that are already affecting us, but also show you just how far we've come. Now, the new normal is a phrase we've all heard plenty of times during the last year in relation to the pandemic. But today, the new US climate normals have been released. Now, they're 30-year averages of key climate observations and are the basis for judging how temperature, rainfall and other conditions compare to what's normal for a given location in today's climate. And what's clear is that we're experiencing a new, warmer normal. And you can see here the US annual average temperature during each normal's period compared to the 20th century average. Places where the annual temperature during a given era was colder than average are blue. Places where the temperature was warmer than average are red. And the influence of long-term global warming is obvious. As we move through the decades, the earlier years have the most widespread and darkest blues. And then if we look at the maps for the latter half of the century, you can see how the difference from the average is warming up, with the most recent map having the most widespread and darkest reds. Now, one place where those warmer temperatures are being felt right now is in California, and almost all of the state is now officially experiencing drought, with much of it classified as extreme. In Marin County, mandatory water restrictions have been imposed, and Greg Milam has been seeing the impact of the drought at Phoenix Lake Reservoir, north of San Francisco, at the sharp end of the very real climate crisis.
This is Phoenix Lake up here, north of San Francisco. This is one of the 7 reservoirs that supplies almost all of the water to this part of California known as Marin County. And you don't need to be an expert to look out there and see what's going on. The water level in this reservoir, they say, is about 30% of where it should be in a normal year. You look up those caked banks of mud there, cracked in the heat here, and the water should be up at the level of the tree line there, at the level of the grass. But it is that extreme situation, historic drought here, they say, is playing out. Just as an illustration, where I'm standing, in a normal year, my feet would be underwater. The water would lap up over the edge of the reservoir into this reed bed and down into the spillway. Across this region, the reservoirs are at 50%, and that's why they've taken this drastic action, they say, of mandatory water restrictions on the 200,000 people who live in Marin County. They can't power wash their houses or driveways, they can't wash their cars at home, they can't fill their swimming pools and hot tubs, because they say this action is needed ahead of course, what's to come, which will be the hot, dry months of summer. And when you look at what the US government scientists are saying about the climate change future of America, for a lot of people here, it's already a modern-day reality.
In today's other climate news, the UK and India have announced a joint agreement to combat climate change. The countries will work together in areas including clean energy and protecting forests. It comes as foreign ministers from the world's leading economies are taking part in face-to-face meetings at the G7 summit in London. The group will discuss how to help vulnerable countries cope with the impact of climate change. Politicians in France are due to vote on a new climate law which has been criticised by environmental groups. It includes measures that would ban some domestic flights and put restrictions on renting out badly insulated houses. Campaigners say the bill doesn't go far enough given the pace of climate change globally. And Uber is working with start-up company Arrival to produce electric taxis. The two companies want to create a greener car that will use Uber's app to automatically match passengers with cars that have sufficient battery range. Arrival's Senior Vice President Tom Elvidge says they aim to start producing the taxis by the end of 2023. Now, you may remember last month, 40 world leaders came together at President Biden's climate change summit. And the pledges that were made there, including new targets on cutting emissions, have changed how much scientists think our world will warm by the end of the century. So here's where we are at the moment, at just above 1.2 degrees of warming. And that number is going up all the time. And scientists estimate that at current rates, this is the amount of time left until we hit 1.5 degrees. So here's the updated climate action tracker predictions for the rest of the century. And they estimate that if there's full implementation of the net zero targets that have been announced or are being considered, global warming by 2100 could be as low as 2 degrees. Now, that's the optimistic targets scenario and is still far above the 1.5 degrees committed to at the Paris Agreement in 2015. If we then look at current pledges and targets, those are unconditional commitments that governments have made and officially submitted to the UN. It's thought that there'll be 2.4 degrees of warming by 2100. That's 0.2 degrees cooler than before the Biden summit. Now, if no change was made to policies that are currently in place around the world, it's estimated that global warming will be as high as nearly 3 degrees by the end of the century. Now, phasing out coal as a power source is going to be crucial in keeping those global temperature rises below 1.5 degrees. But a new report has found that British banks' financial support for companies involved in the coal industry has actually increased since the 2015 Paris Agreement. So, UK investors provided loans and underwriting services worth nearly £22 billion to coal companies during 2019. Now, that's an increase of nearly £16 billion compared with figures for 2016. And it makes the UK the third largest investor in the coal industry after the United States and Japan. And many British banks have pledged to address their climate policies and stop financing coal projects. Despite that, Reclaim Finance says the UK's top 10 financial firms are responsible for 78% of the country's total coal investments. Well, our business correspondent Paul Kelso joins me now. So, Paul, just how much pressure are banks under to reduce their investments in coal projects?
There's political pressure. We heard Secretary of State Antony Blinken tell economies that were still investing in new coal that they would be, in his words, hearing from the United States. But there's pressure around the way coal is financed, coming in the shape of this report, and indeed from the bank's own commitments to green not just their businesses, but their investments. And the reason people are looking at the City of London is because no matter what you burn, power generators need money, and the City of London is built on great reserves of finance, and how that finance is deployed will have a great impact on whether climate commitments can be met. Now, this report shows that British banks are investing still heavily in coal around the world: Bangladesh, Indonesia, South Korea. Some of it indeed going into companies that the campaigners say fund new coal developments, which is something coming at a time when there's general agreement coal has to be phased out. About half of that funding is coming via Barclays. Like many banks, it has committed to greening its investment book, but it has said that the best way to do that is to fund the transition to clean energy rather than just withdrawing the funding to coal power. Now, campaigners will say that's quite a good way of also ensuring that balance sheets at banks don't get hit, and ultimately shareholders and indeed perhaps investors won't lose out. The truth is that as long as there is coal being generated, as long as there is profit as well as power in funding coal, the City of London and other financial centres are going to retain an interest in investing in it.
Paul, thank you. Now, when you think of nature helping to tackle climate change, forests full of trees sucking in carbon dioxide probably come to mind. But far more carbon is stored in the seas around the UK than in the forests on land. And a new report published today is calling on the government to treat rewilding the oceans with the same level of urgency as reforestation. Here's why the sea is so important in fighting climate change in 60 seconds. Well, joining me now is marine conservation analyst Kelly Forsyth. So, Kelly Forsyth, just how important are our oceans for storing carbon?
Often, when people think about carbon storage, the first thing that comes to mind is forests. And whilst forests all over the world do play an important role in carbon storage, so does the ocean. So, the oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surface. Our oceans are actually the world's largest carbon sinks. The ocean and its ecosystems, such as seagrass meadows, marshes, and mangrove forests, play a really vital role in capturing carbon and are actually known as blue carbon systems. However, the oceans are also home to tiny microscopic plants called phytoplankton. So, like other plants, phytoplankton are able to change carbon dioxide into oxygen through a process known as photosynthesis. This is particularly important as carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, meaning that it contributes significantly to global warming, sea surface temperature, and ultimately climate change. These tiny plants are the backbone of the marine food chain and end up being eaten by zooplankton, or tiny microscopic animals, which then get eaten by fish, and the chain goes on and on, eventually resulting in about 10 billion tons of carbon being transferred from the atmosphere into the different layers of the ocean. So phytoplankton alone are responsible for providing around 50% of the oxygen in our atmosphere, which is around the same amount as all of the plants on land.
Now, before we go, we've just got time to show you the real-time power mix in Great Britain. And today, a huge 63% of electricity is coming from renewable sources at the moment. And that's in part because of the blustery weather that we've been seeing across the country. According to the National Grid, a new wind power record was set yesterday with 17.6 gigawatts of power generated, providing nearly 50% of electricity. And that's everything from us for today. On the Daily Climate Show tomorrow, find out how much limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees could affect sea levels around the world. See you then.